we have safe and secure elections. It's not helpful for either party. And I think either party needs to look at what they're saying and then just realize that when you lose, you lose. Accept the facts that you have lost and move on.
As Democrats and Republicans shift their focus to next year's midterm elections, Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, who stood up to President Trump, blames both sides for the growing distrust in the electoral system. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. We're just under a year until the critical midterm elections in November 2022. Republicans and Democrats are focusing their attention on the crucial forthcoming congressional, gubernatorial, state and local elections. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives and 34 of 100 seats in the Senate are up for grabs. As it stands today, the Senate is split 50-50, with Vice President Kamala Harris, the President of the U.S. Senate, holding the deciding vote. But trust in American democracy has been severely dented following last year's presidential election, with Donald Trump and his Republican allies continuing to question, if not deny, the outcome of the vote. A new poll found that only 58% of Americans trust elections, of which only 20% are Republicans. Another poll found that while 91% of Republicans said they had faith in their state's election results in 2016, confidence dropped to 62% in 2020. Brad Raffensberger, Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, was the target of one of President Trump's efforts to question the fairness and integrity of Georgia's election count. In his new book, Integrity Counts, Brad Raffensberger, a lifelong Republican, speaks out against Trump's claims of voter fraud in the 2020 elections and blames both parties for undermining trust in the democratic process. Brad Raffensberger joins me now. Secretary Raffensperger, you have been saying that both Republicans and Democrats need to accept defeat when they lose elections and move on. But can you really equate between the two sides when, let's face it, many Republicans still refuse to accept that Joe Biden won the last election?
Well, that's why I wrote Integrity Counts. It's fact-based, gives people all the data points that really just helps people understand in the state of Georgia, President Trump came up short. And so I also provide information that's relative, it's very available, but I want people to understand that 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential ballot. They didn't vote for anyone, and yet they voted down ballot. And Senator David Perdue actually got 20,000 more votes in metropolitan Atlanta and Athens than President Trump. And our Republican congressmen actually received 33,000 more votes collectively than President Trump did in their congressional districts.
Why then are you fudging the issue, though, seemingly, Secretary Raffensperger, by saying that both sides are equally to blame? Because one side, clearly, the Republican side, still refuses to accept the legitimacy of the election, still says it was stolen from President Trump, pressured you to change the results, when the other side, the Democrats, are simply calling out the unfairness as they see it, the voter suppression that they see in the current election laws.
Well, actually, 3 weeks ago when Stacey Abrams was in Virginia, what she said is just because you win doesn't mean you've won. And so even now, 3 years later, she still has not conceded that she lost by 55,000 votes.
Well, she did concede. She did concede, Secretary Raffensperger. No, in fact, she was speaking to to a congressional hearing on the 20th of April, and she did say that the Republican she ran against won under the current rules. She objected to the rules. She wanted to change the system, but not the election results.
Well, the system that we have in Georgia is fair. We have more early voting than any state, like when we compare ourselves to, for example, we compare ourselves to New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. We have now 17 days of early voting, up from 16. And then we have counties that are allowed to have Sunday voting for 2 Sundays if they want to. We have record registrations. And we also have moved away from signature match to photo ID, and we've been sued by both the Democrat and Republican parties on that.
There is expanded voting, though, from on the one hand, Secretary Raffensperger, but it still doesn't balance the scales, does it? Because if you just look at what's been happening in your state, Georgia, 8% of polling places have been shut down, 40% of the state's precincts have been relocated. Making access to voting that much harder for many people, especially Black voters who live far away from voting places. You know this as well as I do.
Well, but here's the point on all that. where you're talking about those counties, they're actually run by Democrats, and the county election boards are controlled by Democrats, and the election director are controlled by Democrats. So it's really Democrats would be, if your argument is correct, that it's actually Democrats suppressing their own vote. And so the counties are the ones that set that, not the Secretary of State's office. And so they're the ones that do that, but they really base it on population growth and different changes. But if you go back to November 2020, we had no lines that were longer than 1 hour in the afternoon of Election Day. So the counties have done a great job on working on that.
You are running for re-election in 2022 against pro-Trump Republicans who continue to push the false narrative that the election was stolen from Trump and who still refuse to accept Georgia's election results that you, as Secretary of State, certified after several recounts. Isn't that far more worrisome to you than Democrats criticizing electoral laws that make it harder for some Americans to vote? I mean, shouldn't these issues be the ones that you focus on if the aim really is the integrity of future elections?
I wrote the book Integrity Counts, and what I've done is talked about everything we faced since I took office. When Stacey Abrams lost in 2018, when I came in 2019, I had 9 lawsuits from Stacey Abrams, and we pushed back on that. And I also talk about in my book that they poll tested the word voter suppression back in 2014, and they found that that was a good get out the vote strategy. That came through a deposition, through a legal action. And so I talk about that. What I said is that obviously President Trump ramped it up to a whole different magnitude. We understand that. He had the office of the president that has tremendous positional power versus when you have 50 governors. And I get that. But Stacey Abrams, in effect, laid the table for this whole myth of stolen election claims. And both parties need to stop it at whatever level. It can be city council, it can be state representative, and it can be governor or president of the United States. When you lose gracefully and then move on. If you want to run again, then by all means do that.
You wrote in the book, quote, "For the office of the Secretary of State to recalculate would mean we would somehow have to fudge the numbers. The president was asking me to do something that I knew was wrong, and I was not going to do that. The president, you say, threatened you with prosecution if you didn't do what he told you to do. Quote, it was nothing but an attempt at manipulation." Should there be serious consequences to what he was clearly asking you to do, which is commit fraud?
Well, that's a legal question. I'm an engineer, so I let the lawyers do what they need to do. My job as Secretary of State is to make sure we have honest and fair elections. We follow the law and we follow the Constitution.
But do you think he should face criminal charges? Because in your book you detail Trump's pressure on you to overturn the election results.
There's several people right now investigating that. Those are all lawyers. They have teams of lawyers, and I'll defer to the wisdom of what the courts do and what those lawyers do. But what I will say is I'm going to fight hard for honest and fair elections. That's my job.
All right, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Now, as the Republican Party evaluates its electoral strategy ahead of next year's midterm elections, the outcomes of recent gubernatorial races are a warning sign to President Biden and the Democratic Party. In the state of Virginia, which Biden won by a 10-point margin a year ago, Republican Glenn Youngkin, a newcomer on the political scene, defeated longtime Democrat and former governor of that state, Terry McAuliffe, in last week's election. In New Jersey, a reliably Democratic state that Biden had won by 16 points and one of 18 states that formed the so-called Blue Wall, Democratic Governor Phil Murphy narrowly defeated his Republican challenger by a 2-point margin. As the president's approval rating hit a new low, 38% according to the most recent poll, there were growing tensions among moderate and progressive Democrats over the recently passed $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill and the decision to hold a separate vote on Biden's $2 trillion Build Back Better draft legislation. Amid the ongoing public recriminations for the party's recent election setbacks, can Democrats bridge the divide and unite behind a common strategy to retain their congressional majority in the midterms? Joining me now, former Democratic Congressman from Virginia, Jim Moran. He is the co-founder and former chair of the New Democrat Coalition, a caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives made up of centrist Democrats. Congressman Moran, you were with Terry McAuliffe on election night when he lost the race for governor of your state, Virginia, which had been a solid blue state in recent years. Were you surprised by this defeat? Should Democrats have seen it coming?
Unfortunately, I was not surprised. It was clear to me 2 or 3 weeks out that this was not going to work out as we wanted. the momentum was with his opponent, Glenn Youngkin, and Youngkin was getting very large crowds. He didn't have any guests with him. There was clearly a groundswell. It wasn't occurring inside the Beltway in the metropolitan areas, but it was occurring in the rural and outer suburban areas. And that's where the majority of the vote is, of course.
And was that the problem, that the Democrats haven't focused on these areas, the rural communities of America? I mean, have they learned anything that they didn't already know? Because there has been this growing disconnect between the party and voters for years, especially in these rural communities. I mean, if you just take a look at the results in Virginia in 2008, Republicans won 4 small counties by 70%. This year, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Glenn Youngkin, was above 70% in 45 counties, and he won by over 80% in 15 of them. Can it get any worse for Democrats?
Well, it can, actually. It can get worse, and I fear that it will. There's a reaction to what the Democrats have done with the power that they had, controlling the governorship in Virginia, the presidency, and the House and the Senate. I think there's been an overreach, and as a result, there's been a reaction. It's important to bear in mind that Joe Biden lost 5 out of every 6 counties in the United States. But those 1 out of every 6 counties that he won, they represent 71% of our gross domestic product, our economy. They are the drivers of progressivism, if you will. They're communities that pride themselves in being woke, as they say. It's the entertainment industry, it's high tech, it's particularly educational institutions, and in many parts of the economy, at least the very large multinational corporations. That's where the money is, that's where the influence is, but that's not necessarily where the votes are in America today. And as a result, we have something of a civil war going on.
Well, you say you have something of a civil war, and you've warned that Democrats could face bloody midterms if they don't resolve their differences on Capitol Hill. There is this growing schism between the centrist wing of the party and progressives. How do you unify behind one message?
It's obviously a challenge, but there needs to be a recognition that politics is the art of compromise. Many of the progressive leaders, and I feel that I'm progressive. I've introduced a lot of progressive legislation throughout my political career, but I also try to be pragmatic. That's why I never lost an election. Well, I don't have to knock on wood anymore since I retired, but I think it's important to be both pragmatic, realistic, and as progressive as you can be, understanding that this is a democracy.
But can you be all of these things? Can you be all of these things at once? Well, some of the centrists are not willing to compromise, and the differences between them and the progressives aren't getting any smaller. They won't be resolved overnight either. Is the party deluding itself by believing that these deep ideological differences can be fixed between now and the midterms?
Actually, it was the progressives who wouldn't compromise. There's no good excuse for not passing a $1.2 trillion hard infrastructure bill. The Senate had passed it. The House had the votes to pass it. The progressives wouldn't pass it until they could get the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill that they wanted. And so they said that both bills have to be tied together, or we're going to hold the infrastructure bill hostage. And as a result, there was no real accomplishment on the part of President Biden when we went into this Virginia statewide election. The Democrats should have given him a clear victory, and that would have been a victory, but the progressives wanted it all. And I think that's somewhat immature and unrealistic. And of course, it backfired.
But isn't it easy, though, to blame it all on the progressives? You were once a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, although you are a centrist on economic issues. As you know, 6 progressives voted against Biden's infrastructure bill, among them Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She once said that in any other country, she and Biden would not be part of the same party. And she knows that the progressive base is a base that can be galvanized and energized. Just look at the way Bernie Sanders energized the base. She said this after the Virginia election. She says, "I know that Virginia was a huge bummer. And honestly, if anything, I think that the results show the limits of trying to run a fully 100% super moderated campaign that does not excite, speak to, or energize a progressive base." Is that the key problem with the Democratic Party right now? An ideological identity crisis, trying too hard to moderate their position to find a middle ground. Some Democrats even viewing members of their own party as a bigger threat than Republicans.
No, that's not true. And AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is wrong. Terry McAuliffe ran a very progressive campaign. He sided with the labor unions. He was pro-choice. He was in favor of more spending, childcare, higher teacher salaries, etc. He ran the quintessential Democratic campaign, and he got beaten by conservatives. His campaign really didn't reflect the fact that 37% of Virginia's population considers themselves conservatives, 34% moderate, and only 23% consider themselves liberal. So AOC is suggesting we should have doubled down on that liberal base. It didn't come out. It never really comes out. It's a lot of very well-educated, generally young people, some people of color in urban areas, but they don't represent a majority. The majority are families who live in the suburbs, who care mostly about having safe communities, having good schools, and having a responsive government that understands their needs.
But Congressman, let's face it, though. I mean, doesn't the Democratic Party have a branding problem, not just in Virginia, but in so many parts of the country where rural America feels neglected?
Yes, we do have a branding problem. The majority of the country feels that we are much too liberal, that we're not listening to them, that we don't understand their real concerns, which is inflation, cost of living, trying to pay their bills. They want good schools. They want schools that aren't teaching what they consider radical theories, but simply focusing on education. And they want safe neighborhoods. They don't want a party that's going to support defunding the police. They need the police. They don't want a party that's going to support teachers no matter what. I think many of our public school teachers should have found creative ways to provide face-to-face instruction during the COVID pandemic. We went 18 months, and a lot of people, particularly in rural areas that are not computer savvy, they're never going to be competitive in the modern workforce because they lost all those years of education. You can't, with many children, you can't educate them virtually. And parents were trying to do that, and they were screaming out, "You're not listening to us. Stop listening to the teachers' unions. Listen to the parents." And that became a crux of Glenn Youngkin's campaign, allegedly supporting parents over the bureaucratic institutions and the special interest groups that the Democratic Party pays the most attention to.
Congressman Moran, always good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith.
With Republican candidates scoring major wins in Virginia, one Democrat was re-elected to Virginia's House of Delegates. Sam Rasool has been warning about the growing disconnect between the Democratic Party and voters, especially in the suburbs and rural areas. He joins me now. Sam Rasool, first of all, congratulations on your win.
Thank you so much.
Yours was a rare victory in a state where Republicans won statewide races. What was the major stumbling block for Democrats?
I think it was the lack of ability to be able to connect to the everyday voter. What we see is there's a growing divide between the establishment and the party. And I think the everyday voter, and we need to evolve pretty quickly, especially ahead of the 2022 midterms next year.
And there's less than 12 months to go. You've said, quote, "We spent entirely too much time talking about Donald Trump." The Democratic Party of Virginia tried to tie Youngkin to Trump. It didn't work. Will Democrats heed the warnings? Will they move away from their anti-Trump strategy moving forward?
Yeah, what a lazy strategy in trying to continue to harp on Donald Trump. What we need is messages that help people resonate with what we stand for as a party. We have so much that we can talk about We made this mistake in 2016, continuing to harp on him. And now we needed to do something different. We did not. We paid the price. So hopefully, moving forward, we can learn this lesson.
But was it just the fact that the Democrats focused too much on Donald Trump, or was it also the schism among Democrats themselves that led to this result? Because moderates blame progressives for pushing the country essentially too far to the left and making the party less competitive in elections. Progressives, on the other hand, blame the centrists for failing to inspire and galvanize the base of the party. There's also the declining support for Democrats among moderate voters, especially in the suburbs and small towns, rural America. Is the Democratic Party repeating the same mistakes of the past?
Yeah, very much so in different ways. And it's a great question. Here in Virginia, what happened is that the establishment moderates were the nominees, and they put forward a very bland type of campaign that did not connect very well with people. So, beyond ideology, it's really the process of campaigning, connecting with people, ensuring that people feel heard and respected, a sense of agency that needs to be recognized. So I don't feel like this was along the ideological spectrum. The challenge here was not connecting with voters as we should have.
As you should have, and as the Republicans did. Now, as well as back in 2016, when Donald Trump and his party were able to capitalize on people's growing disenchantment in the suburbs, in rural areas, while Democrats were being seen as the detached elites who focused on urban centers, on big cities. Will this lack of focus on rural communities come back to haunt Democrats in the midterms, or do you foresee a change of strategy?
Well, as the first Muslim ever elected in Virginia history, I'm elected out here in the foothills of Appalachia and the westernmost Democrat elected in the House. I have seen kind of firsthand where people feel as though they are forgotten. And so the key here was giving a sense of agency, people feeling as though that they have control. I think that the Republicans were able to do more of that. We certainly have a lot more work to do on the Democratic side in rural America. And hopefully moving forward, we can start to right those wrongs for sure.
You tweeted this following the elections in Virginia. You said there is a rift between our Democratic Party and the people caused by heavy establishment politics. You said this must change. You are a progressive who relies entirely on individual donors. In the world of American electoral politics, we all know the power of big corporations. How much of a negative impact is money in politics having on voters' perception of their candidates and the growing economic frustration of many voters?
Yeah, we see that, and it started really about 40 years ago when even Democrats said we need to raise a lot of money. The problem is that it stops us from taking on issues, socioeconomic issues that people really need us to step up on because we don't want to anger some of our donors. And that came really to a head in 2016, where a candidate then, Donald Trump, was able to say, hey, the reason why you have these frustrations are because of Mexicans or Muslims, or blaming all these other folks. What we need to do as a party is to turn the corner and say we are going to be representing the voice of the people first and foremost.
Newly re-elected Virginia delegate Sam Rasool, great to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now let's just imagine for a moment an ice cream parlor with only two flavors on offer, vanilla and chocolate, or in this case, a voting booth where there are only two options, red and blue. That is the political choice American voters have. The crushing defeat of Democrats in Virginia last week is not particularly surprising. The political pendulum often swings back when one party controls the White House and both chambers of Congress. The American electorate seems averse to the hyper-concentration of powers, whether it's in the hands of Republicans or Democrats. The real prospect, though, of losing next year's midterm elections and the specter of Donald Trump returning to the White House still looms large and frightens Democrats. Ideologically, both parties are stretched to the limit. For Democrats, there is an already visible splintering of the party, with progressives not shying away from open dissent with the party's leadership, its rank and file, and most importantly, President Biden himself. Republicans have an existential problem on their hands. Cut the umbilical cord to Trump and you lose a hardcore base of irreducible Trump cult-like followers. Keep Trump as the party's flag bearer And you lose more centrist, urbanized Republicans, a prospect you cannot risk in swing states, those that tend to savor both chocolate and vanilla. And so, in short, the binary choice offered to the American electorate is showing its limits. It could also exacerbate tensions brought to the fore by the January 6th insurgency, which almost brought the Republic to its knees and is still under investigation. Whether it can thrive with a two-party system, ill-suited to meet today's new demographics, ideological aspirations, and sociological realities, is an open question. A question that both Republicans and Democrats would rather avoid for now, hoping that vanilla and chocolate are flavors that the new Twitter generation will pledge allegiance to. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry. Join us again next week as we take another look inside America. For now, though, from me and the team, thanks for watching.